Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
You know what it feels like when your chest is full of pride, your hands slightly trembling from excitement, and every glance in the room feels like it's finally aimed at you, not at the person next to you, not at the loudest one in the family, not at the one who's always been the entertainer, but you. I'd waited nearly 2 decades for that moment. I'd burned through long nights, doubting myself, rewriting chapters, deleting whole sections of the book that had once felt like scripture to me. I'd let my social life die, my romantic life flatline, and my bank account hover on fumes because I believed, truly believed, that if I finished this damn thing and got it published, maybe, just maybe, I'd finally stop being a background character in my own life. But I never expected that even that night would be taken from me, stolen with a blinding smile, a microphone, and 5 little words that made the whole room forget whose name was actually on the front of the book. The launch was at a quiet little venue off the corner of 5th and Lexington, a bookstore with more windows than walls, and that warm smell of paper and old wood that reminded me of where it all began. There were string lights overhead, low jazz in the background, wine flowing in clinking glasses, and maybe 50 or 60 people, all gathered because they'd either read my novel, believed in it, or at the very least pretended to care. I wore a simple dark green dress that I'd bought on clearance, but felt like $1,000,000 in, and my publisher stood beside me, giving a short speech that, for once, didn't reference anyone else in my life. It was about me. Claire Bennett. Author. Finally. When they handed me the mic, I wasn't shaking. I thought I would be, but I wasn't. I felt grounded, present. I thanked the people who had supported me, mentioned the friends who stuck around during those weird, obsessive writing phases, and even gave a nod to my parents, though God knows they'd never read a single draft. I was about to close out and let everyone mingle when I felt a hand on my shoulder, warm and familiar. I didn't even have to turn to know who it was. Melissa. My sister has always had a way of inserting herself into moments that didn't belong to her, and doing it in such a way that you'd feel rude for calling it out. She smiled that big, toothpaste commercial grin and leaned into the mic with the confidence of someone used to applause. "Hi everyone," she chirped, drawing laughter immediately. "I just want to say how proud I am of Claire. My big sister. My rock. The family genius." People clapped. I smiled. It was fine. Expected even. She was the showman, the spontaneous one. No big deal. But then she kept going. And while we're all here, and I hate to hijack the moment, she laughed again, this airy, playful laugh that told you she didn't hate it one bit. "I just got a call this morning, and I landed a movie deal. My first real lead role, a thriller, being filmed right here in New York." Cheers. Applause. Whistling. I didn't clap. I didn't even breathe. I stood there, mic still in hand, frozen. The attention, which had taken me years to earn, shifted so fast it made me dizzy. People were hugging her. Some came over and said, "Wow, what a talented family," or "You both are stars," but I could see it, the real eyes, the ones that lit up when Melissa was around. They weren't looking at me anymore. And you know what? I could have lived with that. I could have gritted my teeth and let it pass, just another one of Melissa's spur-of-the-moment fireworks. But what got me, what stayed lodged in my throat like a glass shard, was how she looked at me afterward. Not with guilt. Not with shame. But with smug, gleaming satisfaction. Like she'd won a game I didn't even know we were still playing. The event ended not long after. People filtered out, many of them talking more about casting calls and film premieres than character arcs or narrative structure. My publisher smiled tight-lipped and said we'd circle back in the morning to talk press coverage. I packed up my things slowly, watching Melissa take selfies near the book display that featured my face on the poster, as if she belonged on it too. Maybe she thought she did. When I got home, I didn't cry. That surprised me. I just sat at my desk, in my tiny apartment that still smelled like takeout and coffee grounds, and opened my laptop. There was a half-finished short story I'd been dabbling with, something personal I never meant to share. But instead of working on it, I opened a new document. Blank screen. Blinking cursor. And I typed. Some people take the spotlight. Others build their own damn stage. I stared at that sentence for a long time. The next morning, while Melissa was still soaking up her attention and I knew she hadn't even read my book past the first chapter, I reached out to someone from my past, a connection I hadn't spoken to in over 6 years. Someone who didn't just understand words, but what it meant to weaponize them. Because I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to make a scene. But I was going to answer back. And I wasn't going to miss. Long before the wine glasses clinked and my sister's voice cut through the room like a flashbulb stealing attention from my book launch, there were other moments, smaller perhaps, less public, but just as sharp, just as unforgettable. That formed the quiet sediment of resentment I spent years pretending wasn't there, until it hardened into something I could no longer ignore. You see, people often think these kinds of betrayals happen all at once, like a lightning bolt splitting the sky. But the truth is far slower and more insidious. It's a leaky faucet, drip by drip, erosion masked as affection, where each little cut is softened by a smile, a laugh, or that old family excuse we all know too well. Oh, that's just how she is. Melissa had always been that person who walked into a room and somehow rearranged the gravity. She didn't just crave attention, she absorbed it, fed off it, made it her oxygen. Even when we were kids, she'd step on stage during school plays like she owned the auditorium, while I sat in the second row, holding flowers, clapping like a damn groupie. She could say anything, didn't matter if it was true or kind or even remotely related to what was happening, and people would lean in, laugh too hard, nod too enthusiastically. As if the universe had quietly appointed her the star and the rest of us were just background props in her personal sitcom. I never challenged it, not really. I thought it was better that way. Safer. In high school, I remember this one Friday in May, junior year, when I'd spent nearly a month working up the nerve to ask this guy, Darren Feldman, to the spring formal. He wasn't particularly special, not the football captain, not a genius, just one of those rare boys who made eye contact and asked questions that showed he actually listened. I had a moment with him, by the lockers, where he smiled at something I said about the English project we were both stuck on, and I felt, for just a second, like maybe I wasn't invisible. I told Melissa about it. Not to ask for advice, not even expecting her to care, but just because it felt nice to share something for once. 2 days later, she showed up to dinner with his hoodie tied around her waist and a story about how he'd asked her to the dance. No apology. No hesitation. Just a shrug, and that phrase that used to be her favorite, you snooze, you lose. College was worse. I got into NYU on a partial scholarship, not a small feat, not for a working-class family like ours, where my parents still acted like they were being hunted by overdraft fees. I was the first to leave home, the first to live in the city, to juggle 3 jobs and coursework and somehow still write late at night in that tiny dorm where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor breathe. The acceptance letter had barely been printed before Melissa announced that she was deferring her last semester at State College because she'd landed a role in a student film in Manhattan. Suddenly, I wasn't moving to New York alone, no, we were moving to New York, together, like some sitcom about quirky sisters trying to make it big in the city. I got a mattress on the floor of a 2-bedroom in Queens and paid rent I couldn't afford just so she could crash for a while and chase auditions that mostly ended in disappointment and unpaid gigs. But every time I even hinted at setting a boundary, at asking for space or silence or even just one weekend without her borrowing my clothes or dominating every conversation at school mixers, she'd look at me like I'd broken something sacred. I thought we were in this together, she'd say, all wounded eyes and theatrical pauses, and I'd fold every damn time. When my manuscript first started to come together, not the scattered ideas or half-finished plot lines, but something real, something with bones and blood, I kept it quiet. Not because I didn't want to share it, but because I knew what would happen. Melissa had a way of making things hers, even if she didn't mean to. It was like standing in the sun and watching your shadow disappear beneath someone else's. She'd interrupt my writing time with minor crises that somehow always required immediate attention, or she'd roll her eyes at my little book project, as if I were playing make-believe while she chased real artistic goals. There was no malice, at least not openly. Just that relentless belief that whatever I was doing would never outshine what she could be doing, if only she had the time, the money, the motivation. I was the doer. She was the dreamer. And dreamers somehow always get forgiven. After college, our paths diverged a little. I got a job as a copy editor and slowly chipped away at my novel between contracts and deadlines. She floated from city to city, couch to couch, relationship to relationship, always chasing the next breakout role that never quite materialized. But she was still the favorite. Not in a cruel way, just in that quiet, unshakable family way, where everyone simply expects more from one sibling than the other. When I got promoted, my parents sent a text. When Melissa booked a minor role on a local soap, they threw a dinner. I used to joke that I'd need to win a Pulitzer to get a decent group photo out of them, but some jokes come with teeth. And still, through all of that, I invited her to my book launch. Of course I did. Because that's what you do when you're the quiet one. You include, you accommodate, you forgive before the offense even lands. Somewhere deep down, I still hoped she'd surprise me. That she'd stand in that room, raise a glass, and for once just let me have my moment without stepping into it like it was hers to share. But she couldn't help herself. So when she grabbed the mic and dropped her movie deal bombshell, I didn't just hear the words. I heard every moment that came before it, every dance she hijacked, every boyfriend she borrowed, every party she made about herself, every compliment I gave that she never returned. Every time she treated my hard-earned success like background noise to her latest big idea. That night didn't begin with her announcement. It began 25 years ago, in our childhood kitchen, when she threw a tantrum because I got the bigger piece of cake, and my mom swapped it without blinking. Some habits don't change. Some people don't either. But I had. And this time, I wasn't going to swallow it. Not quietly. Not gently. The next morning, as I reread the draft of the message I was preparing, the one that would change everything, I added a new sentence at the top, something I hadn't written before but had always known. Just because you've always been the center of the room doesn't mean you belong there. And then I hit save. Because the next move? That one was going to be mine. When I say that revenge wasn't my first instinct, I don't mean it in the poetic way people sometimes use to sound like they're taking the moral high ground. I mean it literally. It wasn't the first thing I felt, or even the second. The first thing I felt was disbelief, so sharp and numbing it made me question if the entire launch had actually happened the way I remembered it, or if I had misread the room, misunderstood the moment, and maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting. The second feeling was humiliation, not the dramatic, fall-on-your-knees kind, but that low-burning, private kind that simmers beneath the surface and makes every replay of the night play like a blooper reel in your mind, each scene a little more warped than the last. And only then, after the embarrassment had curdled into something bitter and cold, did revenge appear, not as a violent impulse or a desire to scream, but as a quiet, clear, deliberate idea that clicked into place like the last piece of a puzzle you didn't know you were solving. It started with a phone call, not to my sister, because I wasn't ready to hear her voice and pretend everything was fine, and not to my mother either, because I knew that conversation would somehow end with her defending Melissa's big heart and lack of awareness, as if those qualities excused her from accountability. No, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 6 years, Jaime Keller, a name that wouldn't mean anything to Melissa, but carried weight for me because Jaime was the woman who first told me, over coffee and a shared almond croissant, that my writing had the bones of something cinematic. Back then, she was just an assistant at a mid-tier production house, barely scraping by, overworked and overlooked, much like me. We'd bonded over our mutual exhaustion with the industry's obsession with spectacle over substance, and even though our paths had diverged, we'd kept each other's email addresses like backup keys to old apartments. Jaime, as it turned out, hadn't stayed an assistant. She was now an executive producer at an independent studio that had recently sold 2 series to one of the big streaming platforms, and though I hadn't known it at the time, she'd been following my writing career quietly, respectfully, without inserting herself. When I reached out, I didn't ask for favors. I just told her what had happened, in plain terms, without embellishment or spin. She listened without interrupting, and when I was finished, there was a long pause before she said, very calmly, "Claire, would you be open to talking about adaptation rights?" That was when the real setup began, not the petty, knee-jerk kind where you rush online and post something out of spite, but the slow, methodical kind that requires restraint, patience, and the ability to hold your tongue when every part of you wants to scream. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with Jaime twice in person and once over Zoom with her creative director, who'd already read my book and had ideas for a limited series format, 6 episodes, tightly written, character-driven, with room for emotional arcs and social commentary. Nothing was official yet, but it was moving, gaining traction, and most importantly, I kept every detail to myself. I didn't tell Melissa. I didn't even tell our mutual friends. I didn't want leaks or whispers or any version of the truth getting distorted before it was ready. If I was going to respond to the moment she stole from me, I wasn't going to do it with volume, I was going to do it with precision. And so I waited, biding my time, checking in with Jaime only when necessary, while outwardly pretending everything was business as usual. Melissa, meanwhile, was basking in the afterglow of her performance, not the movie role, mind you, because it turned out there wasn't an official contract or signed deal, just a verbal conversation with a producer who saw potential and had a vision, if the funding came through. She didn't mention that in her announcement, of course. In her version, it was already happening. She even updated her Instagram bio to actor, lead in upcoming feature thriller, and I watched, without comment, as her follower count climbed, her photos grew more curated, her captions more breathless and vague. She was riding a wave that hadn't even hit the shore yet, and I knew exactly what was coming. Once the development team gave me the go-ahead, not for production, but for early announcement, I drafted a post. Not a brag. Not a flex. Just a clean, deliberate message thanking readers for the overwhelming support of my book and sharing that an adaptation was in early development with a studio known for prioritizing story over spectacle. I named no names. I offered no timeline. Just enough information to spark curiosity, just enough restraint to let people ask the questions themselves. I scheduled the post for 9 o'clock on Monday morning, a time carefully chosen, not for dramatic effect, but because I knew Melissa's routine. She liked to sleep in after weekend events, and she always started her week scrolling. I imagined her waking up, stretching, checking her phone, and seeing my face, not on a red carpet, not with a script in hand, but as the confirmed creator of something real. I didn't want to hurt her. That's the strange part. I just wanted her to feel what it was like to be on the other side of the mic. To have the room turn, slowly and without warning, away from her and toward someone she thought would never take up that kind of space. And when the post finally went live, when the comments started rolling in, first a trickle, then a flood, I didn't feel elated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Like I'd finally let go of a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying. Because this wasn't about showing off. It was about balance, correction, realignment. The moment she stole from me had been emotional theft, pure and simple. But my response, measured, elegant, rooted in truth, was not theft. It was reclamation. I had built something. Not just a book, not just a career, but a story that mattered. And now the world would see it, not through her filter, not through her performance, but on my terms. I didn't need to steal anything. I just needed to wait. Because the best revenge, I was learning, isn't loud. It's undeniable. The morning my announcement went live, the sky outside my window was a flat, colorless sheet of early spring gray, the kind that makes the city look quieter than it really is, and I remember standing by the sink, watching the steam from my coffee rise in a slow spiral, trying to focus on the weight of the mug in my hand rather than the knot that had tightened in my chest, not from fear or nerves, but from something more electric, more loaded with anticipation. Like standing on a ledge you built yourself, about to step off, not to fall, but to finally fly. It was exactly 9 o'clock when the scheduled post appeared on all my accounts, a carefully worded, professionally crafted, and quietly assertive message that thanked readers for their support of the Black Hourglass, announced that development talks were officially underway for a serialized adaptation, and noted, without a single ounce of sarcasm or vanity, that I was deeply honored to see my story begin its journey toward a different kind of screen. I hadn't added exclamation points. I hadn't tagged anyone. I hadn't even included a photo of myself. Just the book's cover, my words, and a quiet confidence that, for once, I allowed to take up space without apology. Within 5 minutes, my phone lit up like a switchboard, pings from Facebook, retweets, DMs from people I hadn't spoken to in years, emails from contacts I didn't remember giving my address to, all of them variations of congratulations, admiration, excitement, and a few subtle notes of envy dressed up as curiosity. Some asked questions about the show's direction, some wanted to know if I was casting yet, and a few simply wrote things like, "Finally. It's about time people noticed." I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. The message had landed, and the ripple had already started. But I wasn't waiting for them. I was waiting for her. It was just past 10 when Melissa called. Not texted. Not emailed. Called. No greeting, no hello. Not even a pause for breath, just a sharp, almost strangled voice hissing, "What the hell is this?" And I remember standing perfectly still in the middle of my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel the edge of it. "I figured you'd see it," I said, my tone measured, calm, maybe even a little detached, the kind of calm that only comes when you've rehearsed a moment in your mind 1,000 times and finally get to live it without flinching. I didn't want to bring it up at the launch. Didn't want to hijack the moment. She didn't laugh. She didn't speak. For several seconds, all I could hear was her breath, uneven and rapid, like she was pacing or crying or both. "You made me look like a fool," she said finally, her voice lower now, almost shaky, but not out of guilt, more out of confusion, like she couldn't quite grasp how I'd managed to pull the rug out from under her without ever laying a hand on her. "No," I replied, still standing still, still watching the light shift across my kitchen table. "You did that all by yourself." And, just like that, the air between us changed, no longer the sharp tension of a fight, but something colder, heavier, a mutual acknowledgement that the rules of our relationship had been rewritten. She didn't hang up immediately. There was another long silence, during which I imagined her staring at her phone, looking at the post again, maybe even scrolling through the comments to see just how many people were praising something she had no part in. Eventually, she said, and I remember this clearly, because her voice cracked just once, "You've been planning this." I didn't deny it. There was no point. She wasn't wrong. "Not planning," I said, carefully choosing each word, just waiting for the right moment to say something that mattered, without being interrupted. That time, she did hang up. The next time I heard from her was 2 days later, an unannounced visit, the kind that used to be charming in our early 20s, back when she'd show up with a bottle of wine and a story about some terrible date. But now, standing on my doorstep, no makeup, hair pulled back, wearing the same oversized hoodie she always wore when she felt small, Melissa looked like someone who had finally realized the spotlight wasn't a guarantee, that it could shift, that it could be earned by someone else. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't even look me in the eye. She just stood there and said, quietly, "You didn't have to do it like that." And I wanted to tell her, really tell her, that I hadn't done it like anything. That I'd spent years shrinking, editing myself down, making room for her chaos, her drama, her moments, because I'd been taught by family, by tradition, by her, that there was only so much room in a family for one person to be extraordinary at a time. But instead, I just said, "I know," and closed the door, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to feel, for once, what it meant to hold a boundary without collapsing. Later that night, as I scrolled through another round of messages, this time from journalists, book clubs, production assistants, and even one vaguely worded inquiry from a screenwriter I admired, I found a single message from someone I didn't recognize. "Read your book in one sitting." Never thought someone could put that kind of silence into words. "Thank you." And that was when I realized it wasn't about revenge anymore. It never really had been. Revenge was the spark, the thing that pushed me off the edge I'd been staring at for years. But what came after, this steady, quiet unfolding of recognition, not fame, not glory, but but being seen, that was something different entirely. It was freedom. But freedom comes with a price. And I was about to find out what mine would be. There's a strange kind of silence that comes not after a storm, but right in the middle of its aftermath, not the peaceful, clean silence people imagine when they think of closure or calm, but a dense, waiting silence. Like the kind you find in an empty theater after the lights have gone out but before the staff comes in to sweep up the mess. And in that silence, if you listen hard enough, you can still hear the applause echoing, faint and ghost-like, and feel the heat of performance lingering in the air. That's the kind of silence I lived in for the week that followed the announcement, a space where people buzzed around me, where emails flooded my inbox and texts kept pinging in at odd hours, full of opportunity and speculation and excitement. But underneath it all, there was this hollow thrum of something unresolved, something that clung to the edges of every conversation and refused to be named. Melissa never replied to my last message. She didn't follow up with a call, or an apology, or even one of her usual passive-aggressive text chains filled with sarcasm wrapped in fake sweetness. She simply disappeared. Online, her posts slowed to a trickle. No more behind-the-scenes updates, no photos from faux-urban photo shoots, no vague hints about her upcoming film project, which I now knew was nothing more than a half-formed pitch that hadn't even cleared development purgatory. For someone who had built an entire persona around being visible, around being seen, her silence felt louder than anything she could have possibly said. At first, I thought I'd feel triumphant. I expected, or maybe just hoped, that watching her retreat from the space she'd so casually claimed as her own would bring with it some sense of vindication, some hard-earned justice that would balance the scale after all the years of watching her commandeer the air in every room we shared. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the kind of relief you get after holding your breath for too long, necessary, maybe, but far from satisfying. My mother called 3 days after the announcement went live, and I could tell from the way she opened the conversation, not with congratulations or we're proud of you, but with a heavy, almost practiced sigh, that this wasn't going to be the warm, supportive check-in I'd secretly been hoping for. I just think, she said, in that measured, emotionally manipulative tone she had mastered over the years, that you could have waited a little longer. You know how sensitive your sister can be. I remember sitting on the edge of my couch, holding the phone just far enough from my ear to keep myself from snapping, and thinking how often those words had been used to excuse Melissa's behavior. Sensitive, emotional, passionate. As if every storm she stirred up was simply a byproduct of her artistic soul, as if the rest of us were meant to anchor ourselves and withstand her tempests because her feelings were somehow more real, more urgent than ours. She hijacked my book launch, I said slowly, carefully, without raising my voice. She stood in front of 50 people and made my night about her. She didn't mean to, my mother said quickly, almost reflexively, the way you'd swat away a fly before you even registered its buzz. She was just excited, and she thought you'd be happy for her. She didn't think about me at all, I replied, and then, after a pause so long it felt like we were standing on opposite ends of a canyon, I added, and maybe that's the point. My mother didn't argue. She didn't agree either. She just said, in a voice so soft it barely registered, I hope you two find a way back to each other. But I wasn't sure I wanted to. In the weeks that followed, my inbox filled with requests for interviews, podcasts, early press junkets, and even an inquiry from a literary festival I'd long admired, but never imagined I'd be invited to. My publisher, now suddenly invested in my future, offered to fast-track the next book if I had anything in the works, which, of course, I did, because I had always been working, always building something quietly in the shadows while others took center stage. For the first time in years, I felt not just acknowledged but respected, and that feeling, elusive, tender, electric, was more addictive than anything I'd known before. And yet, even in the midst of it, there were moments, small, sharp moments, when I would see something that reminded me of Melissa. A half-watched movie we once loved. A song that used to play in the background when we shared that terrible apartment in Queens. A scarf she left behind on my chair 2 winters ago that I kept, not out of sentiment, but because I forgot to throw it away. Those moments came with no warning, and when they hit, they didn't knock me over, but they did make me pause. They made me wonder if revenge, no matter how justified, always came with collateral damage you couldn't predict, not blood or broken glass, but fractures that ran deeper, that quietly rearranged the structure of what you thought was permanent. And then, one afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after it all began, my phone rang. It wasn't a number I recognized, just a local area code and a string of digits that meant nothing on their own. But the moment I answered and heard the pause on the other end, I knew. Melissa didn't speak right away. She didn't even cry, at least not audibly. She just breathed, shallow and irregular, as if gathering words she hadn't rehearsed. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of performance and charm. "I read your book," she said, and that was all it took. Not congratulations, not an apology, just a quiet admission, so loaded with years of avoidance and tension that for a moment I couldn't respond. I didn't ask what she thought. I didn't press for more. I just waited, and eventually, her breath caught again, this time breaking into a single, ragged sob. "I didn't know you felt that way," she whispered. And I didn't say, "You never asked," even though it was the truth. I didn't say anything at all. Because some wounds don't close with words, and some truths, when finally spoken aloud, don't bring peace, only clarity. We stayed on the phone for a long time, saying almost nothing, tethered by something fragile and frayed that may never fully mend. But in that silence, there was at least honesty. There was, for the first time, a shared understanding that what had broken between us wasn't new, wasn't recent, it had simply been exposed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Or maybe it wasn't. Some stories don't end with a lesson. Some just stop and leave you wondering what happens next.